Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to do an analysis of the CET 2020 conducted by the DTE. CET this year was conducted on the 14th and the 15th of March across 4 slots, one in the morning and one in the afternoon spread across Saturday and Sunday. Now overall, if you look at the entire test, the test retained most of its DNA. There were 200 questions to be solved in 150 minutes and there were 4 sections that were present. Overall, if you look at it, the entire soul of the test remained consistent with what it has been like over the last 4 years now. So since IBPS started taking CET, 2016, 17, 18, 19 and now 20 have all been more or less similar in terms of strategy and in terms of pattern. There were 3 broad aspects that an aspirant had to take care of when it came to the CET. The first thing was essentially allotting time to the right section. So there is a general tendency wherein people tend to get stuck in one of the sections and then invariably end up not giving time to the section that deserves the most. That was the first part of it. The second part of it was maintaining a high level of accuracy throughout. So the number of attempts generally means nothing if you are not very accurate. And even in this test, we will be able to see this kind of a thing happening. The third thing was essentially being very fluid in terms of your test taking strategy. So people who had rigid time limits assigned to each and every section would have faced some difficulty when it came to solving this kind of a test. So someone who would have mastered these 3 aspects of test taking would have done really well at this test. Coming to the sections, the 4 sections were consistent with what was expected before the test, and we had a logical reasoning section that had 75 questions. We had an abstract reasoning or a visual reasoning section that had 25 questions. And the quantitative ability and the verbal ability reading comprehension section had 50 questions each. So overall, as we said, there were 200 questions to be solved in 150 minutes. The level of difficulty was comparatively similar across each of the 4 slots except maybe the Sunday morning slot, which was reportedly a bit difficult owing to a difficult logical reasoning section compared to CET 2019. Otherwise, the test was more or less balanced and the logical reasoning section was classified as more or less medium to difficult. The quantitative ability section was more or less on the easier side this year, verbal ability was also easy to moderate and the visual reasoning section was also easy to moderate. There are a few disclaimers before we start with the entire analysis. There were a few new question types that were introduced for the first time in the verbal ability part, the logical reasoning part and also the quantitative ability part. Except that more or less the test remained consistent. Also, there was no negative marking and so all the aspirants were expected to answer each and every one of the 200 questions. There were no sectional time limits and so the candidate had the liberty of assigning time to each and every section of his or her choice. Also, the kind of attempts that we are going to share, which were ideal for any test taker, include only genuine attempts and we are not including any kind of guesswork here. That has to be considered separately and you can expect more or less 20% of the marks that you would have attempted randomly to be a part of your final score. We will look at each of the sections individually and what kind of performance you had to have a good score at the CET. Coming to the first section, we are going to analyze the verbal ability reading comprehension section. As was expected, this section had 50 questions and ideally someone should have spent around 35 to 40 minutes on this particular section to do justice to each of these question types. Broadly speaking, in a manner of pattern, there was one major change that happened this year. So last year we had 3 reading comprehension passages that accounted for 15 marks. This year the pattern changed by a bit and we had only 2 reading comprehension passages that had 15 questions. So one of the passages had 7 questions and the other passage had 8 questions. The passages were more or less easy to read. There were 3 or 4 paragraphs in each of these passages and even an average reader would have been able to go through the entire passage in roughly 2.5 or 3 minutes flat. The questions were very easy to read and understand and there were some inferential questions but mostly it remained fact-based. There were questions that required you to figure out the true statement from the given options. There were questions that involved you to figure out what was the meaning of the word when taken contextually, and there were some questions that were based on your interpretation of a particular passage. So what does the author mean when he or she says this particular line, or this particular line can be replaced by which of the following phrases? Those kind of questions were also present in reading comprehension passages. Except the reading comprehension passages, there was focus on grammar, vocabulary and jumbled paragraphs. So overall, if you look at it, the jumbled paragraphs part consisted of 7 sentences here. So similar to last year's parajumbles, what happened this year was one sentence was fixed and we had to realign the other sentences to create a logical paragraph. In these questions, you had to understand which one was the first sentence, the second sentence, the third, the last sentence. So we had to figure out the rankings of each of these statements. In addition to that, in one of these slots, there was a question that was based on vocabulary when it came to the parajumbles. So when the parajumble says a particular word, what exactly does that mean? So again, a fairly straightforward set. Across these slots, the parajumbles were fairly straightforward and it was not very difficult to create a coherent paragraph given the clues that were present. So anyone who would have taken CETs or would have gone through the material that was provided, you would have been able to solve the parajumble part very easily. So overall, we can say that the parajumbles was on the easier side. The second thing that we are looking at is going to be the grammar part of it. Now, grammatical errors questions had two parts. So there was a sentence that was divided into 4 or 5 parts and we had to spot the parts wherein there was an error. Now there were some changes in instructions as well, and one had to be very careful when one was going through these questions. Because in some questions they asked you to spot the fragments that were correct, and in some questions they asked you to figure out the fragment that was incorrect. So you had to be very careful attempting each and every question because the answer choices were also tricky. So if there was a sentence that was broken down into, let's say, A, B, C, D and E, 5 parts, if A and C were the right parts, you had A and C as one option and B, D, E as another option as well. So you have to be very careful when you are reading the instructions. Someone who would have read the instructions well would have been able to solve these questions very easily because the grammatical error finding part was not really very difficult. The errors were very obvious, and even if you had no in-depth knowledge of the grammar part of things, even then you would have been able to solve most of these questions based on instinct. Also, coming to the vocabulary part of things, there was a question type that was based on multiple usage. So there was a word that was given to you and then you had to figure out which of these sentences or which of the given sentences were the ones wherein this word would not fit or would fit. We also had a question type wherein we had to figure out what was the meaning of each of those idioms or phrases that were present. Similarly, again we had another question type wherein we had to figure out the replacements. So overall, the vocabulary part was not very difficult. Someone who had a fair understanding of word usage would have been able to crack these questions very easily. Also, verbal ability had another question type which was combination of sentences. So again, this has been a question type that has appeared since IBPS has started conducting the CET rather. So we had 2 or 3 sentences and we had to combine these sentences by using one word or a phrase from the given set of phrases. Again, these questions were tricky because there were sub options. So the question was followed by, let's say, 1, 2 and 3, and the answer options were combinations of these 3. So again, if you had a good hold on grammar, if you had a good hold on how to connect sentences, you would have been able to sail through this particular part. The last question type that we are going to discuss in terms of verbal ability involves spotting an incorrect sentence. Similar to what happens at the CAT, we had to figure out which sentence was there that was out of context in a given paragraph. However, the tricky part was one of the options was all the sentences are relevant and can form a paragraph. So this was basically the question type that would have created some amount of confusion, especially if you know that each of the sentences are relevant. But again, when it came to these questions, a lot of people or a lot of students were very comfortable understanding which one of the passages or which one of the sentences was contextually not a part of the paragraph. So there was a sharp contrast that could have been seen in one sentence compared to the others. So not a very difficult question to pick, but then again you had to be mindful of reading a lot of volume to get through one question. We also saw a puzzle that was present in many of these slots wherein there were some 4 words given and you had to figure out whether a word that is present in the English dictionary can be made from the letters of those particular words. So again, a very straightforward question. If you were someone who again had a decent hold on vocabulary, you would have been able to attempt this question easily. Overall, if you look at this, 26 questions can be classified as easy across these slots. We are taking an average across all the slots. 26 questions were classified as easy, some 17 questions were classified as moderately difficult, and there were some 7 questions that were difficult, many of which were a part of the reading comprehension passages. So on an average, a decent aspirant who would have given roughly 35-40 minutes to this section would have been able to attempt 35 to 40 questions easily with a good amount of accuracy. So when I say a good amount of accuracy, we expect the accuracy to be somewhere in the 85s or even touching 90. So 35 to 40 questions would have been a good attempt in this particular section. The next section that we are going to look at is quantitative aptitude. Now again, as was expected, quantitative aptitude had two parts. One was pure maths that was present and the other part involved data interpretation. Data interpretation was consistently present across each of the 4 slots and contributed 18 questions out of 50. The rest 32 questions focused on the quantitative part of things. When it came to the data interpretation part, these 18 questions were classified again into 3 sets of 6 questions each. Almost invariably, one of them was a line set except the last slot wherein we had a bar graph. The other set involved a table and the third set was a caselet. Each of these set types was present across each of these 4 slots, and then again these were the easiest questions in this particular section. Overall, if you look at this section was the one that was different compared to what happened in CET 2019. If you look at it even in comparison to whatever has happened since 2016, so over the last 5 years since IBPS has taken over CET, we could probably say that this was the easiest quantitative ability section across these 5 years. So that was essentially the gist of this entire section. Whoever would have figured this out and would have relied on the reports that were out once the first slot was done would have cashed in heavily in this particular section. The question types were very easy. Again, we saw a lot of questions that were based on approximations. So in each of these slots, there were 5 or 6 questions that were based on approximations and number series. So approximation based questions made a comeback after a lot of years when it came to the CET. And they were very easy questions which involved a basic understanding of the concept of bond mass. If anyone would have been familiar with basic arithmetic calculation, then getting a 5 on 5 or a 6 on 6 in these question types would not have been very difficult. The next question type involved quantitative comparison. Now again, this is one question type that has kept on appearing over the last many years now. Quantitative comparison this year contributed to 10 questions in each slot. There were some 6 questions that were based on arithmetic and there were some 4 questions that were based on quadratic equations comparison. Again, if you had a good understanding of how to compare roots of quadratic equations, then this would have been a cakewalk. Most of the quantitative comparison questions were extremely straightforward, and if you had a good hold on the basics of QC questions, you would have fared really well in these question types. Overall, if you look at it, the non-calculative, the non-data interpretation part of quantitative ability, then we had some questions that were based on arithmetic that were present almost invariably across each of these slots. So there were some 9 to 10 questions that were based on arithmetic. There was a question on weighted average, a couple of questions on percentages, profit and loss, simple interest, compound interest, one on ratio proportion, one on time speed distance, and so on. This split was more or less uniform across each of the 4 slots, and anyone who would have taken it in any of these slots would have found it to be at a similar level in terms of difficulty. There was one question that was present on geometry or mensuration in each of these slots, and it was fairly on an easier level. And there was one question that was based on modern math or numbers. There was one question on probability in each of these slots. So again, that was on the easier side. Overall, if you look at the entire section, there was barely a question that can be termed as difficult. Maybe the ones that were based on data sufficiency were the ones that were slightly difficult. A couple of questions on time speed distance were also classified under the difficult side of things. But overall, if you look at it, the section was of an easy to moderate level. People who were good at quant would have cashed in heavily, as I said earlier, and that would create a difference in the final tally. Compared to last year, wherein good candidates would have attempted somewhere around 30-35 questions, this year a 40 plus attempt was surely on the cards. According to our estimates, a genuine attempt of 38 to 40 questions with almost a 90% accuracy would guarantee a decent score in this particular section. In terms of the time spent on this particular section, if someone would have spent around 40 minutes, this attempt looked practical. So if you would have attempted maybe 38 or 40 questions in around 40 odd minutes, you would have discarded those questions that were not exactly doable in the given context, then you would have benefited heavily. One thing that would have created a difference in this section is the amount of time that you would have spent. So there will be a few people, or there would have been a few people who would have spent a disproportionate amount of time on this section because it was classified to be an easier section. The key was to solve this entire section within the 40 minutes that you would have allocated to the section otherwise as well. So instead of getting carried away and devoting 50, 55 or 60 minutes to this section, which would have created a chaotic situation in some other section definitely, if you would have stuck to your time limit and would have maybe had an urgency when it came to solving these questions, you would have greatly benefited win this particular section. So this is generally going to be the make or break section this year, because anybody who would have fared really well in this section would have a very good advantage over someone who would have struggled with this particular section. The next section that we are going to look at is the logical reasoning section. Now this was a section that had scared many an aspirant, and people in general were wary of facing this particular section. Now as a thumb rule, this section has generally contributed to 40% of a candidate's overall score if you look at it. Now the pattern was consistent. There were 75 questions. It was split into two parts. One was the verbal reasoning part, which involved a lot of critical reasoning based questions, and the other involved non-verbal reasoning part, which focused almost exclusively on arrangements. Now across slots, if you look at it, there were 7 sets that were present, which contributed some 41 questions. Now almost invariably in each of these slots, there was one set each on a circular arrangement, on linear arrangement, on arrangements that panned over 2 rows. There was an appearance of a question type that again has been consistent over the last many years, wherein there are a lot of people sitting in a straight line, somewhere in the tune of 25 to 30 people. So these kind of questions were consistently present across each of these slots. Again, many of these questions were classified as difficult, and not a lot of people would have been able to break through these questions unless they invested more than 8 or 9 minutes in a particular set. This was not really advised in a test wherein the other 3 sections were generally on the easier side. So considering that verbal ability, quantitative ability and visual reasoning were the easier sections, it would have been prudent to not waste a lot of time on this particular section and invest time on the other sections instead. Of the given sets that were present, generally 2 sets or 3 sets could have easily been attempted. So there were sets that were based on directions that were fairly straightforward. There were sets that involved only a single linear arrangement that again should have been attempted. So maybe these 2 and at most 3 sets which again involved floor based logic, if you would have been able to crack these 2 or 3 sets, then again you can say that the logical reasoning or the arrangement part of your section would have been sorted. Coming to the other part, there was almost invariably a question that was based on input and output in at least 2 of the 4 slots. The logic was fairly straightforward and it involved a single input and then it was followed by 5 questions. So that was one thing that could have been attempted if you had a good hold on input-output based questions. We also had a simple coding based question. There was no appearance of the IBPS based question type either in terms of an input-output based question set or in terms of a coding decoding question set. These sets remain more or less similar to what has been traditionally asked at the CET, and the logic was fairly straightforward. So these were the couple of question types that should have been attempted. Syllogisms were fairly straightforward. There was again an appearance of that small term in the conclusions part wherein at least some of them or some may not be. So these kind of statements made an appearance which would have made it a bit confusing. But again, if you work backwards and if you would have again followed the questions that appeared at the SimCETs, you would have definitely been familiar with the kind of questions that were asked. Overall, if you look at it, the non-verbal reasoning part can be classified as to be something on the moderate to difficult side owing to the presence of the arrangements based questions. But if you remove the arrangements based questions completely and focus on the remaining 34 questions that were present and also the input output set that was present, I think overall you can make sense of this particular section, and if you would have focused on the right questions and spent around 60 odd minutes on this particular section, I think it would have been a good attempt. Coming to the verbal reasoning part of things, it focused almost exclusively on critical reasoning questions. Critical reasoning questions involve strengthening the argument, weakening the argument, which of the following assumptions are implicit. So we had questions that were based on these concepts. Again, the options were wide apart and someone who would have a decent reading speed would have been able to go through these questions very quickly and would have been able to attempt each question in roughly 45 seconds to 1 minute with a decent amount of accuracy. Overall, if you look at the entire section, this section was slightly difficult, maybe in slot 3 as has been reported by a lot of students and mentors. But overall, if you look at it, it was consistent to what happened in 2019. So overall, this section can be classified as to be something on the moderate to difficult side of things, and a decent attempt in this section would have been around 42 to 45 questions. Now again, as is the case with the other sections as well, we are expecting a very high accuracy in this section as well. So someone would have attempted 40 to 45 questions with a 90% accuracy would have done really well in this particular section. Overall, out of 75, if you are crossing a 50 in this section, it can be considered to be a very good attempt given the context of the entire test. Coming to the abstract reasoning section or the visual reasoning section as it's fondly known as, This section was almost invariably easy across each of the 4 slots of the CET. The catch here was this section was slightly time consuming. So people who would have been very fluent with abstract reasoning would have found this to be an easy section but a slightly time consuming section. So if you had not wasted a lot of time on the logical reasoning section, then you would have some 5 minutes or some additional 5 minutes to spare on this particular section, and that would have made a difference. Now the questions were the ones that you would have routinely seen. So the elements, the kind of questions that were asked, the kind of logic that was present was something that was extremely familiar. So someone who would have taken some CETs, someone who would have gone through the visual reasoning videos that were posted would have been able to breeze through this section, because a lot of those elements made sense, a lot of that logic was something that we had discussed earlier as well. So if someone were a genuine aspirant or a genuine candidate and would have prepared diligently for this particular section, you would have had a very good chance of cracking this section. Overall, if you look at it, the questions were of the easier kind. And when I say the easier kind, it simply means that we didn't really have question types that involved switching of figures. So there was no question that was present which told us that figure A and figure D are to be switched and that's why A is our answer. So we didn't really have those kind of questions. The questions were based on completion of series. So there were some 11 questions that were based on completion of series in each of these slots. Again, each of these questions can be classified as easy to moderate. Again, if someone followed the logic part of things and someone simply compared one of the figures that was present in the question with the options, then again that would have been good strategy to solve many of these questions. Again, introduction of a new element and avoiding repetition of elements was again a strategy that could have been followed in these question types. So the questions were fairly straightforward. If you would have cracked the optimum strategy to solve each and every question of these 11 questions, you would have been able to breeze through these 11 questions maybe in around 10 or 11 minutes. Coming to the other part of the visual reasoning section, we had analogy based questions. So in 3 of the 4 slots, we had an A, B, D kind of a question type wherein the first and the second figures were given to us and the second part of the second pair was given to us. So we had to find the precursor. In one of the slots, we had an A, B, C kind of a thing given to us and D had to be found. So both these question types were fairly straightforward. It was not difficult at all. There were some 7 questions that were based on this logic. The remaining 7 questions were to find the similar or the dissimilar pair. So again, similar to your analogy based questions, there were 2 figures that were connected to each other and then there were 5 options that were given to us, out of which one figure did not show the same kind of logic when it came to the question figure. And we had to spot the one that was different compared to the others. And that was essentially the remaining 7 questions out of the 25 questions that were present in the abstract reasoning section. Out of these 25 questions, a genuine attempt of around 18 to 20 questions would be considered to be a good attempt. Overall, if you would have spent somewhere around 20-25 minutes while attempting these 18-20 questions, it would have been a prudent choice. Some questions were invariably difficult. There were elements that you might not be very familiar with. It involved multiple logic. These were the ones that you could have left alone. But discounting for these 5 or 7 questions, the rest of the questions were fairly straightforward, and if you would have prepared earlier, you would have an edge when it came to this particular section. So overall, if you look at the entire test as a whole, logical reasoning out of 75 questions, one could have attempted around 42 to 45 questions easily with a 90% accuracy. Similarly, when it came to the abstract reasoning section, an attempt of 18 to 20 can be considered as a good attempt. Quantitative aptitude, around 38 to 40 questions, in some cases even more than 40 questions would be considered a good attempt. Verbal ability, again similar to quantitative ability, 35 to 40 questions would have been a decent attempt. Overall, a good candidate could have easily attempted around 135 to 145 questions genuinely. When I say genuinely, it means that you would have read the question completely, would have thought about each of the options or would have solved it and then marked the answer. The remaining answers anyway you would have marked randomly, and that would again contribute to 20% of whatever you would have marked. So overall, around 140 to 145 attempts if you would have made, then typically we are expecting somewhere around 125, 126, 128 marks to come from this kind of an attempt. In addition to that, we are again expecting some 10 to 15 marks from the questions that you would have marked randomly. That kind of an attempt should give you somewhere around 140, 145-ish marks is what we are expecting. Overall, if you look at it, compared to last year where the 99.95 percentile was around the 145 mark, we expect it to go slightly higher. So we are predicting a 146 to 148 score for a 99.95 percentile. Now mind you, this is based on the logic that the number of candidates or the number of test takers would have increased this year. Again, owing to the difficulty in terms of XAT, CAT and IFT, a lot of takers would have focused on CET very aggressively. So we expect the cutoffs to go a bit higher, again paired with the easier nature of the quantitative ability section. Similarly, 99.75 percentile is what we are expecting to be around that 135 to 137 mark, and 99.50 is expected to be around 130 to 132 marks. So overall, we are expecting a rise of around 2 or 3 marks compared to that of last year, and that should basically be the nature of the test. So hope you did well at the CET. Congrats and all the best for the upcoming processes. Thank you.
To explore how IMS can help you, check the links in the description box below. Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to stay updated.